Thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you for that amazing introduction. I really obviously couldn't do this without you guys, and when I was asked to speak about this, it really was a wonderful topic because it brings together a lot of things that I love about what we do in medicine. You know, it brings together the biology of breast cancer, it brings together the technology that we have, and it also brings together a little bit of math, which I do like, if you remember my daughter's speech. So it's really a wonderful way to sort of talk about all the aspects of a disease that really we are making progress in. And so I hope that with this overview, it provides some fuel for questions, and I hope that everybody asks as many questions as they have after I'm done. And if you need me to stop at any point, please ask me to. So we'll go to the next slide. So the question is, why do we screen at all? And I certainly don't have to tell anyone in this room some of the statistics that are alarming. Obviously, breast cancer is the most common invasive cancer that we find in women. And even in the general population, 1 in 8 women in their lifetime will develop this cancer. In 2010 alone, over 200,000 women were diagnosed with breast cancer, and unfortunately, 40,000 women died of their disease in that year. So when we look at these numbers, it's very clear that we need to figure out ways to both hopefully prevent it, but we also need to screen effectively. And so we'll go to the next one. Thank you. Okay. What I'd like to do, that's all right, I appreciate it. What I decided to do when I was putting this together is to talk a little bit about some of the general screening guidelines that exist, then talk about sort of the history of it and the data as to why we got here, then really talk quite a bit about the controversies, because I think there are a number of controversies that have arisen, obviously, in the last year or two. And then I want to focus on some high-risk patients and how we screen them and what's different about it. So when we look at this is where the math comes in. There are some things that we have to define before we talk about it, and so I thought I would give you a snapshot of some of the terms that I might use throughout the evening and what they mean. So when I think about a true positive test, what we think about is you do a test, cancer is there, and we find that cancer. A false positive test, which has been in the media quite a bit now, when we talk about different tests, everybody says, but there are false positives. And sometimes I wonder, do we really know what we're saying? But what it means is we suspect cancer, but there actually isn't cancer there. And so it leads to unnecessary biopsies and other types of events. A true negative is obviously when you do a screening test, there's not cancer there, and we don't suspect it. And finally, a false negative, obviously, is when cancer is there, you think that there might be cancer there, but the test doesn't say that there's cancer there. And so these are important terms as we go along and talk about how different organizations actually look at screening. In addition, when we're thinking about the ideal testing for anyone, it has to be both sensitive and specific. So what is sensitivity? Well, it's not only the number of times there's a positive test, but you want to take that and divide it by those positive tests, but also the false negatives, because if you're missing some of those women, you're not really picking up. If there are 100 women who have breast cancer, but we're only picking up 70, that's not doing so well. That's not a very sensitive test. By the same token, we want it to be specific. We don't want to say that someone has a cancer of the breast when they don't have a cancer of the breast. So that is another term that you'll hear quite a bit. The best test has what's called a high positive predictive value, meaning you see an abnormality, and when you biopsy that, it comes back as cancer. So it's both the true positives, but the true positives plus the false positives, those that we question. So if you do a mammogram and there are, again, 100 women who have breast cancer, but we have to biopsy 500 women to find that, that's not the highest positive predictive value. So why is it important to do screening, and where does this come in? And perhaps the best way to describe it is to go to the biology of breast cancer. If you take time 0, which is where a cancer cell mutates in the breast, so you have a number of benign cells and something mutates, it takes about 3 years at least till we can actually pick it up on mammogram. it takes potentially another 4 years till you actually can feel it. And so in that period of time, we're hoping to pick it up at a very early stage. And that's the goal of any kind of early detection test. In addition, when you look at breast cancer, what we see is that if we can pick it up earlier, so this graph basically shows survival probability. I wish I had I have to get a pointer. I should have brought my pointer. I was thinking I should. But I hope if, and stop me if you need to. Basically, this is in an era even before there was any chemotherapy. And we looked at the probability of survival in breast cancer. And if you found it when that cancer was between 1 and 9 millimeters, there was much more likelihood of being alive and well 16 years later than if you find it when it's 5 centimeters. So the goal of a mammogram, yes?
Sorry.
That's okay.
So the graph that you had before, is there any statistics on if you had an MRI, not a mammogram?
Yes, we'll actually get to that later on. Actually, when I talk about the high-risk screening, a lot of that will focus on the MRI. So we'll talk about sort of the times and such. So it's a very good question, but as I talk about that, I'll address that a little bit more. So when we look at this, this is a very important aspect of screening as well, picking it up when it's early. And finally, what we want to look at is the progression of breast cancer. When we look at the progression of breast cancer, on the left side is the normal duct within the breast. The next stage of that is when the cells have become cancerous, but they're still inside of the duct. And some of you who've been in my office have seen me make really rudimentary pictures of these things and explaining it. To the right is, and I think I should get better pictures like this in my office, and this is when it's invasive. Invasive means that it's come outside of the duct and has the potential to grow. So the reason this is important in screening is we would ideally like to screen and find this when it's in the in situ stage rather than waiting till it becomes invasive. And there's a time course that occurs, and that may be different in everyone. That speaks to your question about different types of imaging and how we do that. So again, putting this all together, what's the ideal screening test? Well, it should be easy to perform. It should be relatively inexpensive. It should be reliable. And by reliable, we mean you can sort of show that to someone else and they'll be able to see the same thing. Ideally, we'd like it to be painless, which those of you who've had mammography know is not always the case. And again, it screens for a disease that has effective treatments. And I think this is really important because as we get better and better at treating breast cancer, this becomes more and more important. So when we go to that, with that, what about mammography? How did all of this start? Well, it was actually started in the 1900s, in 1913. And what a radiologist did was he took mastectomy specimens, because that was all that was done in that era. And he actually started x-raying them to see if he could see them, because the goal was to say, could we see this on a woman? And then in the late 50s, it was actually here in the U.S. That the government actually ran some trials in a couple different sites in the country. And then one of the first and biggest trials of mammography that was randomized. And by randomization, it meant that half of a population was asked to do the screening and half was told you won't do the screening. You'll just go to your doctor and get exams. It was actually here in New York. It was by the Health Insurance program of New York, HIP, at the Guttman Institute. And it's interesting, everything comes full circle. Memorial now owns the Guttman Institute and we use it for screening. So we've kind of gone the full circle. So when you look at it, these trials, it's important to realize that there's not just one trial or one organization that looked at it. There were multiple randomized trials across Europe and North America. And sometimes when you read in the news about screening, it sounds like these ideas and where the screening guidelines came from had no basis. Someone just sat down and decided. But there really were trials, and over 500,000 women were actually involved. There was a whole variation in age in the different trials. There was also a variation in how they were screened. Some of the times they came every year, some came every 2 years. Obviously, in the 1960s when all this started, mammography was not as good as it is today. So when we look at the results,